The man I'm going to introduce to the stage now is an extraordinary man with an amazing story. And he is, without doubt, one of the most impactful speakers in the UK today. Just an amazing voice, an amazing man who has just a really powerful message when it comes to this whole area of resilience. So please give a very warm welcome to the amazing John Connolly. Just come here again, because I said John and not Josh. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the wonderful Josh Connolly.
I always, am I on? I'm on, yeah? I always thought I'd be introduced by you, Simon. I just thought it'd be on Sky Sports. And I thought you'd get my name right, actually. No, look, I don't ever really plan what I'm going to say when I come and do something like this. And having seen all the speakers that have been up so far, I feel like I'm regretting it a little bit. I just want to say a big thank you, firstly, to James for organising this. I know what you've been through to do it, mate, and the effort that you've put in. I think it's incredible. And to bring together everybody in this space and create a space like this that's solely about people talking about this stuff, I think it's needed, and I think it's more important than ever. And the things that everybody said today, I think it makes that really obvious as well. So should we give you another round of applause? Yeah, let's do it. There's a lot of talk about imposter syndrome and kind of, wondering whether you're good enough. I'm looking at that picture, and all I'm thinking is I look about 10 years older than that. And it's over there, and I'm going to see it in my eyeline the whole time. Look, what I want to try and do today in the time that I'm going to speak to you, I don't plan outcomes too much, yeah? And I just want to really get a little bit curious about the things that I've gone through, what I've experienced, and hopefully get you to reflect on your own story in a way that will give you something to take away. I've got 20 minutes. I'll talk for 20 minutes. We'll see how we do. We'll see where we get to. I've struggled all my life, really, with the ways that I feel. I've struggled all my life with my emotions. But when we talk about the thing resilience, when we look at the word resilience, often I think that people think that it means having this ability to keep moving forward, right? This ability to always be able to show up. And throughout my whole life, I did that. It was a little bit like what Clark was saying earlier. I grew up in an environment where, to be strong was to keep moving forward. And what I found is that at the age of 24 years old, I had what was a serious breakdown. For me, that looked like panic attacks in the beginning. I was walking around a supermarket, I'd have to leave the trolley halfway round because I felt like I was going to pass out. And eventually it led me to a place where I very seriously planned to take my own life when I was 24 years old, despite on the outside maybe looking like things were all right. I was very fortunate that I had an experience with my children, which I will come on to, that changed everything for me. And after that experience with my children, I wanted to look at my life and ask myself, how does somebody like me who seemed to always be able to show up, right? Who seemed to be able to keep going no matter what, who always seemed to be able to deal with life, how do I have such a bad breakdown at the age of just 24 years old? And what became clear to me very quickly is that what I'd been calling resilience was literally me holding that breaking point at bay. And I started to look at my life and question, where does that happen? Where did I start getting on that path where life just seemed so difficult? And what became obvious is that despite all my life saying things like, people have it way worse than me, right? Life's hard, sometimes you got to get on with it. I recognized that I'd struggled deeply with the ways that I felt for a long time. I recognized that despite saying, I don't really remember my dad, he died when I was 9 years old, I realized that I'd never had a man in my life that patted me on the back and said he was proud of me. And I think we don't talk enough about what that feels like. We bring the idea of resilience, we bring the idea of toughness, and society to a degree loves us to be able to overcome these things. Loves us to be able to say that we deal with it, life's tough, but you've got to get on with it. And when I start to look at the childhood that I lived, I start to realize that a lot of my feelings and a lot of the ways that I've showed up actually make a little bit of sense. I grew up in a I grew up in an alcoholic home. My dad was an alcoholic, had a problem with alcohol. And what I've started to realize about the ways that I feel as an adult is that things like my anxiety disorder that I was diagnosed with when I was in my early 20s looks a lot less disordered when you look at the disordered environment in which it first existed in. It made sense for me to be in fight or flight a lot when I was a child. My depression was literally that, depressed emotions that were too painful for me to bear, so I pushed them down into my body so that I didn't have to experience them, and they came out of me in things like sleeping too much, rage, addiction. And so what I want to do in the short amount of time that I've got is try and pick apart how I believe so much of what I've experienced makes sense when I look at my story. I grew up with two brothers. I had a brother who was 1.5 years younger than me and a brother who was 1.5 years older than me. And when we were kids, you spent most of your time upstairs. And you did that because you didn't go downstairs because it was too frightening, it was too scary, you never knew really what was going to happen. We learned, or certainly I did, that the rules of the house were that you don't talk, you don't trust, and you don't feel. And it wasn't that my mum sat me down and said, these are the rules of the house. She never wrote them down on a piece of paper and stuck them on the fridge, but I learned them by the ways in which I interacted with my parents. After a particularly bad night, perhaps my dad had been violent, maybe their house was a little bit smashed up. The next morning, my mum would be frantically trying to act like everything was okay. She'd be saying, this isn't your fault, I don't want you to worry about this. Your dad was just a bit drunk last night. And then she'd say something like, you're okay, aren't you? And when my mum said, you're okay, aren't you? She wasn't seeking to create a space for me to explore my emotions. Emotionally, my mum was full and she was seeking for me to validate her need for me to be okay. And as a young boy, I sensed and knew that. So I didn't just show my mum that I was okay. I told her everything was fine, and it's fine, mum, you don't have to worry, everything's okay. And so even at the age of 4 years old, I learned to push down my emotions and show up for my mum in the way that she needed me to be. Now, there's a Hungarian-Canadian physician, a chap called Dr. Gabor Mate, and he says that as children we have two innate needs. The first one is attachment to our parents or primary caregivers. We don't talk anywhere near enough about this. It's not a desire for me to get my mum and dad to love me. It's a biological need to seek attachment from them. The second thing that we need is authenticity. Authenticity at its core is understanding what I'm feeling, knowing what I need as a result of what I'm feeling, and then knowing how to communicate that need within my relationships and my activities. The problems, I think, for all of us arise when that authenticity threatens the attachment. It's the authenticity that loses every single time. Simply put, if I think that by being myself I won't get the love of my mum and dad, then I won't be myself. And I think if you understand that to enough depth, what you start to understand is you don't need an alcoholic dad like mine. In the world that we live in today, adults are under a lot of stress. And if when I feel sad, I sense my mum or my dad go a little bit tight and a little bit tense, and I realize they don't want me to be sad, then guess what I'll learn to do? Not be sad. And as a child, I'll develop something like shame whenever I feel sad so that I don't feel sadness. And as an adult, what happens to me is whenever I feel sad, sadness is not the problem, shame is. Because I developed that when I was younger, because that's how I got attachment to my parents. Now, on top of what I was experiencing, I recognize that I've always been a highly sensitive person. Sensitivity, by the way, is completely misunderstood in Western culture anyway. We think that sensitivity means meek and mild and that we get upset easily, and it might mean some of those things. But sensitivity, I'm talking about being sensitive to touch, sensitive to sound, sensitive to light, but also sensitive to emotions too. And when you grow up in an unpredictable environment, that sensitivity gets exploited. That sensitivity turns into hypervigilance. I become an expert at reading the room. I become an expert at working out exactly who the people want me to be and becoming that version of myself. It means that I go through my life being pretty likable. I'm very good at getting people to like me. I'm very good at working out what you want me to be and making sure that I become that, completely incapable of bringing my own emotions to the table. And by the way, let me tell you, being likable is very different to being liked. Being likable keeps me alone in the world. We know, we've talked about loneliness today. We know that loneliness can be driven by how many people I have around me. Loneliness can also be driven by how much of myself I'm willing to share with you. And if the answer to that, by the way, is nothing, then I'm always alone. And everybody knows what it's like to feel lonely in a crowded room, and that comes from my ability to be able to bring who I am to you. Now, the first way that I reacted to what was going on at home when I first started school was to desperately try and be good enough. To feeling not like I was not lovable at home, I desperately tried to become lovable at school. I think some of the most underreached people in our society in this whole conversation are the people who react to what's going on and what they're feeling by desperately trying to become good enough. Because they ace all their exams and they do so well, and everybody says they just care about everybody else, and they go through their career and they ace everything and they're amazing, and they ace college and they do amazing in their career, and they're chasing the same thing I chased when I started drinking alcohol. And that's a feeling that my life is worthwhile, like there's meaning for me. And that's how I reacted when I first started school. Now I want to talk just very quickly actually about something that happened when I was a child. I remember once the police had turned up at my house and they did what they were very good at. It was restored the peace. They took my dad away. But on this one occasion, I must have been about 4 years old. It was preschool, and I'd come down on the stairs and I was watching what was going on. And the police officer on this occasion went beyond their sense of duty, really, and he came over to the young boy that I was on the stairs, and I was terrified, I was frightened by what I'd seen. And he came down to my level and he looked me square in the eye and he said to me what I think most people would say in that situation. He said, "Don't worry, there's nothing to be scared of. We're going to sort your dad out and everything will be fine tomorrow, I promise." And what he actually did in those very few sentences was completely devalue everything that I was experiencing. I was terrified and he was telling me there's nothing to be scared of. My experience taught me that not only was it not going to be okay the next day, it was going to be a damn sight worse, and he was promising me it would be fine. Now, I used to say the only reason why the police officer would say that is because he's a good man and he wanted everything to be okay for me. Both of those things are true, but I don't think that's why he said those things. And I say this as a parent myself, reflecting on the ways in which I interact with my children. My son is very sensitive like me. I remember once he came to me and he said, "You know what, Dad, I feel like everyone in this house would be better off if I wasn't here." And I said, "You don't have to think like that, right? You don't have to feel like that. We love you in this house. You love watching me play football. I love watching you play football. You don't have to think like that at all." And I do exactly what the police officer did to me when I was on the stairs. And I used to say the reason I do it is because I love him, right? And I want everything to be okay, and both of those things are true. That's not why I say those things to my son. The reason when my son says what he says, that I hit him with the positivity, that I hit him with the solution, with the fix straight away, is because when he tells me like he feels like everyone in the house would be better off if he wasn't there, I can't deal with the ways that I'm feeling. So when I say, think about your football and I love you and I know that you love me, it ain't even about him, it's about me and my inability to be myself in my emotions with him. And I think one of the main reasons, aside from stigma, that people don't talk about the ways that they're feeling is because they don't want you to fix them. Because they want you to step into their darkness and sit for a while, not to fix them, not to change them, but so that they might feel human and heard in that moment. My son at his core knows that the house loves him. He just needs me to hold his hand so that he can see that. You know, when you grow up in an environment where there's bad things happening, and by the way, this happens in every household, when there's stress going on, when there's underlying issues and they're getting swept under the carpet, and you're walking around, and every time you say that you feel sad, there's somebody over the other side of the world that has it way worse than you. When you're stressed, just wait till you get in the big bad world, you don't know what stress is. When you're scared, there's nothing to be scared of. And when you can sense what's going on in the house and no one's talking about it, you find yourself sat on your own a lot saying, "What's wrong with me?" And what I was picking up on and sensing was right when I was a child, but nobody able to step into my darkness and sit with me for a while. You know, people have talked, I think it was Clark that mentioned about the need and how we get everybody to talk and get everybody to talk. You know what I think? We should start getting people to be better at listening and the talkers will follow. Yeah? Like the message isn't talk. The message is create listeners. When I was 8 years old, my dad had spent some time in prison, and I'm doing terrible for time, by the way. I will finish on time. I will finish. Oh, don't tell me it's good, because I got to get back to Wiltshire anyway, so no one's got it as bad as me. My dad came out of prison when I was 8 years old, and that's when I started experiencing shame. Shame is a deep-rooted idea that there's something wrong with me. I remember my dad would take me out, and he'd be really, really drunk, and as I walked 10 yards in front of him, I didn't connect the ways that I felt to how he felt, to what he was doing. The way that I've reacted to my shame throughout my whole life really is to pump my chest out and act like I'm not scared. By the way, what do we do to young boys and girls who are reacting to shame in that way? In our society, we normally shame them. And let me say this quickly, when we talk about stigma, yeah? That's somebody telling me to hurry up. Someone's calling, say hurry up. You run out of time. When we talk about stigma and how we need to break it, yeah? You get yourself on a local Facebook group and see how adults talk about young traumatized boys and girls, and you'll see we're nowhere near getting rid of stigma. Yeah? Because when I reacted to my shame, it never looked pretty. I always talk a little bit at this moment about Tyson Fury. Everyone loves Tyson Fury now, yeah? No one did when he was going through it. He wasn't meek and mild and like, let's help him, he's struggling. He was destructive. And by the way, let me talk about this very quickly. I'm going off on tangents when I'm already running out of time. Yeah? When I was in school, it was much safer for me to be angry than it was for me to cry. I'll throw a chair across the room, I get thrown out of the lesson because boys don't cry at school and I don't want to get bullied. The opposite is true for young girls, by the way, and I'm generalizing, of course. But if a girl throws a chair across a classroom, yeah, she's labeled crazy way quicker than a boy. Yeah, a boy will get thrown out, get a bit of a talking to, be back in the next lesson. A girl throws a chair, she's medicalized very quickly. So girls keep their emotions in, that's why you see more self-harm with young girls, generalizing. Now I want to cut a bit of a traumatic part of the story short, but when I was 9 years old, I was at my dad's flat when he took his own life, and I didn't phone an ambulance. And the reason I didn't phone an ambulance is because when I saw him there, and I'm getting emotional about it because I should, and that's appropriate, I didn't phone an ambulance because I knew if I did, my mum would know what I'd seen, and I didn't want her to know. So I waited in the flat, and eventually she rang the phone, and I said, Dad's really drunk, I need you to pick us up. My mum picked us up out the front, and we went home. It was me and my younger brother, and 2 days later, I found out my dad had passed away. Now, people say, how does a young boy of 9 years old become so emotionally available for his mum in that way? I'll tell you why, because that's what we teach kids to do. Because what do we adults tell kids when their mum or dad's struggling? Your mum needs you to be strong. At my dad's funeral, everyone told me your mum needs you to be brave now. What did they mean? What did they mean when they said your mum needs you to be brave? I'll tell you what they meant. I don't think I could deal with the emotion that I know that you need to express. So I'm going to tell you to be brave, you'll keep it in, and I get to feel more comfortable. When we tell people to be brave from an emotional standpoint, it comes from a place of fear. Now, my overwhelm, my struggles turned into, I got till 25 past, didn't it? Yeah, 28 past. When I got to senior school, I started to deal with that emotional struggle with anger. Now, I do a lot of work in schools, yeah, and I work with a lot of young boys and girls who are on the brink of exclusion normally. They call it early intervention. And what they do is they send me to kids that are either about to be excluded or that are using drink and drugs. Once they've started using drink and drugs, let me tell you what it is, too late intervention. Because it's hard to compete with alcohol and drugs. That's the truth. Because my life got good when I found them. I stand here today, I'm nearly 10 years sober, free from alcohol and drugs. I don't hate alcohol. I'm thankful that I found it because nobody else was giving me anything. Alcohol saved my life. I don't think I would have got through my teenage years without it. Dealing with how I felt. How quickly I became obsessive about it. And my dad had given me the perfect example of how not to be, and yet I found myself being just like my dad. Now, trauma does run in the family, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's genetic. Alcohol changed my life, to be honest with you. And for me, and I haven't got time to talk about it, but when I started hanging about down the path, I've always been a very loyal person, right? In my own dysfunctional way in a lot of times, right? But I've always been hugely loyal growing up. I was a problem at home. I was a problem at school. I desperately needed attachment. I wanted to feel wanted, loved, needed, part of something, like my life had direction. I found all of that down the park. And very quickly and easily I was groomed into a gang and manipulated into a gang, and I found all of the things that were missing from my life. We understand different types of exploitation. We're not there with criminal exploitation, not yet. Our juvenile prisons are full of young boys and girls with incredible loyalty, who had their loyalty misplaced because they were searching for meaning. And that's what happened to me. And for me, it went from gangs when I was in my teenage years to in my later teens and early 20s, it was football violence. All the same thing. The main guy at the top of the crew, I wanted to impress him. I wanted him to like me. I wanted him to feel like I was needed. I wanted him to pat me on the back and say, I'm proud of you. And I've still searched for that all of my life, by the way. I found it now. I ain't gonna have time to talk about it, but I found it. What happened is my life spiraled out of control. When I left school, I got good grades. My alcohol problem was already far gone. I was already using lots of drugs. My first daughter was born when I was 18, and I began to pass my traumas on to my kids. I did what I thought society expects of me, by the way. I got a house, got a job, got a car, did all of that. At 19, I had a mortgage. Let me tell you this very quickly, by the way. I didn't want to create a broken home for my children. I created one by staying in a toxic relationship. Yeah. My children have 2 loving homes now. Yeah. By the time I was 24, despite progressing in my job, the lovely thing about alcohol addiction, by the way, is as long as you pay the bills and keep down the job, then you ain't got a problem. Yeah. And as a sober man, it's the only drug I ever have to explain not doing. No one's ever asked me why I don't do crack. Everyone asks me why I don't drink. Yeah. By the time I was 24, I was back living on a fold-out bed at my mum's house. I was £17,000 in debt. I was 9.5 stone, so there were some positives. But I didn't want to be here anymore. And I'd stopped drinking on the 14th of May 2012, and what happened to me is that my life got worse. I couldn't deal with the ways that I felt. Some of those behaviors that I used to blame on drink were still there, and now I couldn't blame them on drink. And I made what felt like a very honest, noble, and selfless decision to take my own life. And I went to see my kids. I had 4 of them at the time. And because I knew I was going to die, the past became irrelevant, the future was non-existent, and for the first time ever in my life, I was present with my kids in a way I've never experienced before. I remember cuddling my daughter and feeling it like I'd never felt, and I thought, this is what it's about. And ever since that day, and that weekend, my life has changed immeasurably. I have a new idea of what resilience is, by the way. I don't not struggle. I don't like saying, I've done it all, so can you. I still struggle. I'm still sensitive. I still get overwhelmed easily. But I have ways of dealing with that today. I have men in my life, particularly men, because I've always found men very scary. And I've learned to have men in my life now that can care for me and that I care for them too. I've remarried. I've got a business now where I get to speak all over the world, and I have a new idea of what this means to me. Resilience is not just the ability to keep moving forward. It's not just the ability to always show up. It's the ability to understand myself on a deep enough level to make sure I get my needs met. And my life is immeasurably different as a result. I'm going to leave you with one analogy, and then I promise you I've finished. And this is about listening and the importance of listening. All my life, I felt like I was on a sinking ship. I was just doing enough to just keep my head above the water. And I had a bucket and I was emptying it like that, and I was doing just enough so I could just breathe. And people would come by and they would see that my ship was all off course, yeah? And everybody would say, his ship's off course, let's get him back on course. And they'd all jump on the ship and get me back on course, and I'd be sailing in the right direction, and they'd say, wow, look, we saved him, look what we've done. A week later, my ship would be miles off course, and people would say things like, well, if he doesn't want to help himself, we won't bother. And what they didn't realize is that coming on and steering my ship, my experience never changed. I was still just emptying the bucket. What I recognize today in supporting people is that sometimes it's not about going on and getting them back on the right path. It's about jumping on the ship and grabbing a bucket. And that gives me the opportunity to step up to the top of the ship and try and find the direction myself. And it will take me longer, but when I get there, it will be real empowerment. Thank you very much for listening. I've gone a little bit over. I appreciate it.